Welcome to a community update from the Department of Senior Affairs. I'm your host, Ed Nunez. Today's guest is Cindy Brown, social worker from Home Instead Senior Care. And we're going to be talking today about the silent generation. Cindy, welcome again. And
thank you.
We just talked about that, and you've been a guest of ours at least 7 or 8 times, and you have always a lot of great, we talked about senior bullying, a lot of great senior topics that you've brought to the show. So we always appreciate you being on.
I always appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Yeah, we happen to see each other at the Isleta conference out there, and every time I always think about calling you, but then it's sandwiched around the job at the center. So at Manzano Mesa, we've always got something going on. The summer program is just over a couple months ago, so the dust has kind of settled a little bit. Although we had a big event last Saturday, the Sandia Crest Marathon. So there's always something big, community event going on, and that's the purpose of what we do. So anyway, it's always good to see you. So Cindy, we'll get right into it. What is the silent generation? When you mentioned that, I was like, it intrigued me. It always does. So what is the silent generation?
When I mentioned it to you, you gave me this look like,
Yeah, like I always do. Like when any topic we're going to talk about, I'm like, okay, I'm like quizzically thinking in my mind because I have a lot of seniors where I work at, and I've worked with a lot of seniors during my time in the department. So I'm always kind of interested to know what that means.
Well, it's interesting that you ask, because we've heard about the senior tsunami. We've heard about the silver tsunami that's coming because the aging population is growing so much. So I was having a conversation with one of our clients a couple of months ago, and we were talking about how that there's this group of folks in between the baby boomers and the greatest generation. Because the greatest generation, that's 1910 to 1924, the kind of the World War II veterans. Those are kind of considered the folks that, Tom Brokaw wrote about,
right?
I believe, and he wrote The Greatest Generation.
That's my father. I think about my father, a World War II vet who passed away in 1990. But whenever I think of that, that's still tugs my heart, man. Still.
Well, the residents and the participants and the folks who filled our assisted living facilities, our nursing homes, our senior centers, our senior programs, those folks, for the longest time, they were the greatest generation. And we thought we understood them because we kind of had been working with them for so long, and we had an idea of what we were working with and what was important to them and what their needs were. So I was talking to this gentleman, and he made the comment that people have forgotten about his group. And I said, your group? And he goes, yeah. And he goes, there's a group of us that are between the greatest generation and the baby boomers. And we're not baby boomers. We're not quite there yet. Because the dates are, when you think about the greatest generation, 1910 to 1924. The silent generation was born between 1925 and 1945, the same year my dad was born.
All right.
The baby boomers started in 1946, but they go all the way to 1964. So that's a huge kind of swath of demographic. And so his perspective is that as senior providers and as folks who are designing programs or working with seniors, we need to kind of get a better idea of what the silent generation is and what they need and what's important to them. So I started doing some research. And it got my attention that this is a large demographic of folks who we really haven't given that much thought to,
right?
At least not that much conversation to, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the things when you talk about the greatest generation, everybody talks about World War II and working in the mines, and my grandfather worked in a sawmill for 10 cents an hour. So I always hear those stories. And my father was a laborer, a plumber. Went to trade school, so then of course you have the World War II generation. So when people talk about that, that's kind of hard for any generation to stand up to, because that generation that they talk about, the greatest generation, how do you measure up? I mean, how does a silent generation or any generation that follows, how do they measure? How do they measure up to that? People talk about the patriotism during World War II. You hear all the old films, and a lot of it's propaganda. Sure, it is. Because you got all this great music, and it's war, man. It's it's during so it's a hard generation to live up to. So anything, any generation, the millennials, whatever generation that followed that. How do you and tell us more about, please tell us more about the silent generation.
So it was interesting because he made the point that in order for us to serve his demographic, we better learn about his demographic. So, here I go. Of course, the first thing we all do,
Right. Google.
Google.
Yeah.
So what I discovered is there are 50 million Americans who were born between the year from 1925 to 1945. 50 million Americans.
Oh, yeah, that's significant.
That's a significant demographic. And they are, however, the smallest generation, because they are smaller than the greatest generation, and they are much smaller than the baby boomers. So even 50 million, when you think about 50 million seniors, that doesn't sound like a small group of people, but compared to the baby boomers and the greatest generation, they're a smaller generation, which I think contributes in some ways to the fact of the silent generation. The reason why that they're a smaller group is, from what I'm understanding, is because the uncertainty of the war and the war years, until the war was over, that was kind of when the baby making started.
Right.
And the other thing was that the depression. Folks were not yet sure that we had hit prosperity yet, because we're trying to come out of the depression, and then we end up in the war years, and so folks were still kind of trying to figure out what the post-war years were going to be as far as prosperity, and could they provide for their families the way they wanted, et cetera, et cetera. So until the baby boomers came along, until after the war, when it was pretty clear that America was going to be prosperous, you didn't see the big, huge jump. So they're a smaller generation. They are very, very powerful in that their patriotism is just as powerful as the greatest generation. This is a patriotic, civic-minded group of people. They are more traditionalists. When you think about, people in the baby boomers, they talk about the new age and, what was it they called it, the 70s, the love babies and all that good
late
stuff.
Late 60s, early 70s?
Right. So this is a very patriotic bunch of folks. These are people who still had a work ethic that was very powerful, and they still had the savings ethic, even though they were coming up during the time when they first kind of introduced buying on time, buying on installments, those kinds of things after the war, when appliances and luxury items became much more available and more affordable. These are still the group of people who are saving their money and putting it in the bank. They're just quietly socking it away, because they've lived through a time that wasn't so sure. They've lived through a time when their next meal, their next pair of shoes, their future was not assured. The other thing is, this is the group of folks that grew up without the safety net that the baby boomers had. The safety net of the social welfare system, because that came along right after the war, was when it really got started in terms of a safety net for people with unemployment and with housing assistance and all those kinds of things. The silent generation still didn't have that yet.
Well, FDR had started some of that. President Roosevelt had started some of that.
Right, but they were already in their late teens, early adults.
I see.
When you think about when that started to happen?
Right.
Yeah. So they grew up in a time when
Very interesting. Yeah.
they're very, very, still very close to the Depression era because of the stories that they've heard and what they've witnessed. So their lives are still very much shaped by the tradition and the conservative, help me out.
Conservatism.
You can't say it either. Exactly.
No.
Me and you both.
Yeah.
This is also a group of folks that were still very, very self-reliant, but they were also very politically active. The fact that we call them the silent generation, I'm starting to think that might not entirely be accurate, because this was the group that really started the civil rights movement. They started speaking out about things that nobody had spoken out before. They really and truly started the stuff that shaped our lives and our generation. And so were they really that silent? Not
That's what
so
I mean.
much.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I don't know,
They're small.
Right. Is that
so I'm not sure that they're that silent.
Right.
These were folks who also got to see the science and technology advances that just blew the world away. Dramatic changes in how everybody did everything. Dramatic changes in vehicles, dramatic changes in machinery, and things being automated and things being mechanized. They were the first generation that started experiencing that on a large level. Mm-hmm. These are the folks. The Hoover folks, when I say the Hoover folks, means they got a Hoover vacuum cleaner.
I see.
So their lives were changing pretty dramatically At the same time, they were also experiencing their own deprivation. This was during the time when these folks were young, was during the time of the Dust Bowl, which affected a huge part of the population and moved so much of our population from the Dust Bowl states to the western states. You saw a huge population move, and people gave up that generational farmland because they couldn't live.
That's economically, they were wiped out because they couldn't grow plants, and they couldn't. People forget about about that era, and that was especially from Oklahoma and on, a lot of movement. So that's a lot of good points, and the reason I was smiling earlier is because the layaway plans. Do you hear about those anymore? I don't even think you even hear about layaway plans.
There's only a few.
I had to smile because when you mentioned that, the safety net. My father grew up in the Depression, and man, that guy, I say this with much love and affection. Boy, that guy was cheap, man. And I say this with love, though, because his idea of, going out was 5 burgers for $1, whatever he could get. And it's because he grew up, he had to work for what they had, man. They did. And my father wasn't going to spend any money that he didn't have. And he still sent us all to private school. He had to save for that. Still did that. So when you said that, I had to smile because it brought back a lot of memories. My mom would call him Diamond Jim. Because Diamond Jim wasn't going to spend no money unless he had to, when the savings thing. He taught me. I opened my bank account when I started with Parks and Rec when I was 16. I had a little bank account at the bank, and I was proud of that. I was growing and saving. My wife and I still kind of try to do that. But yeah, all those things you mentioned brought back a whole bunch of memories, and all of them good. All of them real good memories.
When you think about it, the folks from the Greatest Generation and then the Silent Generation, these are not huge risk takers financially. They were risk takers more so socially, as far as the Silent Generation, because they took some huge risks with the Civil Rights Movement and some of the conversations that they started and some of the things that they started changing. But when it came to financial and when it came to working, they had a strong reliability factor. These folks were the ones that never, ever, ever put their job in jeopardy. They didn't spend money they didn't have. And part of the reason why is because they had seen what it was like when you didn't have it. And the only way they got it was to work for it. So if you didn't work for it, you didn't have it. There wasn't anybody standing there going, hey, here's your safety net.
So, man, that is very interesting because there's a lot of people that still have we still have this argument today about safety nets. Too many of them, too much entitlements. Some will say, right? So that's it's fascinating. By the way, I saw your little Tennessee Volunteers here. I just noticed that. So sorry to break the stride here. I know you're still a Southern girl at heart, right?
I am.
Okay, remember this is New Mexico, though, right? You still embrace the land of
I
enchantment.
do. Just don't make me eat chili.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, we'll edit that out somehow.
So that I don't get death threats.
No, it wouldn't be anything like that. Yeah. But anyway, that's very interesting. Very, very interesting because it wasn't there. It wasn't taken for granted, right? There wasn't going to be Social Security or right. And we still don't even know about that. And we might last for us. I don't know. The next generation we'll see, right? So that's very interesting in the mindset, what the Silent Generation, the Greatest Generation, what separates them? I got to ask you that because people are going to say they're going to concentrate always on the Greatest Generation, always, right?
Yes.
So what separates them? What accomplishments can the Silent Generation say? We did this, you mentioned some things, but what separates them from, the Greatest Generation, who the Greatest Generation people always make movies about and things like that. So what separates them?
What separates them are several things. One thing is the advances in education that were made. Folks began to focus again on the younger generation, and they began to focus on, were we educating our youth in the absolute best possible way? So the old reading, writing, and arithmetic people started taking a look at it and developing education opportunities that were much more advanced than they had ever been. And the expectation for people to achieve more education was brand spanking new. Because in previous generations, if you didn't have your high school diploma, it's pretty much okay because you could always do something else. You could always work with other forms of labor. With the Silent Generation, they put a huge emphasis on finishing high school because finishing high school gave you more opportunities. And that was the first generation in some ways that really started to look at education as more than just the basics. And they started seeing education as being necessary for both boys and girls. Not just moms going to, not just women and girls becoming moms and wives. There was beginning to be a place for women in the workplace.
Okay, in the professional workplace.
Education. Exactly, education.
Advancement.
And it was expected that parents would educate their children more than they had been educated.
Interesting.
Which, when you think about it, this is the same bunch that, did the, these were not your in-the-face kind of people. They were not the ones that were really aggressive. They were much quieter. They were kind of the walk softly but carry a big stick kind of folks. Mm-hmm. And so it was amazing to me how when you look at those generations, you see how the civil rights movement, how it really got started. The way it was started was really very quietly. It was started with people changing how they had conversations one-on-one, like me and you. That's how the civil rights movement really started, and it was with this generation. They started thinking differently, seeing situations differently. Even though they were traditionalists in many ways, particularly fiscally, these were the people who started talking about what was wrong in the world and actually being upfront with each other about what needed to change. That's how the whole thing started. That's how the whole thing started.
Economically, politically, socially.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Racial division. Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
That's very interesting. Yeah, it really is. That's how things usually happen, or conversations. And I'll say the silent generation, when it came to the civil rights movement, was anything but silent. I mean, after a while. I mean, there's a lot of civil unrest during the early 60s, mid 60s. A lot of civil unrest. It still amazed me, I think, when I read about it later, that people had to go through such trauma to vote, man. I just couldn't believe that. It's a right guaranteed for everybody. And then, in the South, and not only other places I don't want to talk about the South, that's your homeland.
It's okay.
But it was a very tumultuous time in the United States. So, I'm a history guy, history buff,
Me
man.
too.
I love history.
So when you think about what's going on, when we started becoming really aware of the civil rights movements and the major changes that were happening, the silent generation folks, they were the older folks who were sitting back a little bit and watching it happen. They weren't the ones necessarily carrying the signs, but they were the ones that said, hey, we got to talk about this. The thing that happened was McCarthy made a huge impact on this generation in particular.
Senator McCarthy?
Yes.
Because that is saying everybody's a communist.
The
Joseph
censorship.
McCarthy from
Yes.
Wisconsin. This everybody knows.
Yes.
Some of the people might forget. Me and you know who he is, or you and I.
Because we...
Right. History.
Too much history.
Anyway, go ahead.
What happened was they realized that if they didn't speak out appropriately and in the right way, the consequences would be huge. So these were people who started on almost, and I mean, even less than a grassroots effort. It was a one-on-one. It was a conversation with your neighbor, conversation with your brother, your daughter-in-law. This is how the change in our society really started to happen. And it started happening because this is a group of people that had lived in the children are to be seen and not heard kind of generation. But they were also the first people who started talking about what needed to change and what was right and what was wrong. So this was a very brave, very courageous group of people, but they didn't always necessarily realize it. Because when we think of bravery and courageousness, we think of the folks, the veterans, walking through the war. That's how we looked at bravery. But when you think about what these people were starting to talk about, they were starting to accept people into their social circles that was never acceptable before. Neighborhoods started looking different than they ever had before.
Interesting. This is after the war. After the war. Yeah,
These are
demographics changing, everything.
These are the folks that were born between 24 and 45. So my dad was born in 45, so this was his peer group. This was also a group that was still very, very religious. But they were thinking for themselves. Because when you think about how the population is, when it used to be super, super religious, people didn't ask questions. People didn't question things. You accepted what you learned, you accepted what you told, because children were to be seen and not heard, Thought and free thought wasn't exactly encouraged.
That's true. That's true. I remember that. I mean, I went to go to Holy Ghost 8 years, St. Pius, the old St. Pius 1 year, and that's kind of the way it was. You didn't have any, just, the teacher was always right, principal's always right, coach is always right, right? So
Boss is always right.
No questions, right? So things have definitely changed. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, it's interesting to me how that this group of people were honest about what they saw and honest about what they were experiencing and honest about how they felt, and that was the first generation that was open about it. They weren't in your face, but they were open about it. They'd talk about it at cocktail parties. And when I think back to and talking to my dad, he said, this was a time where we wanted to talk to people face to face. This was, even though the telephones were very, they were a part of life then, he said people still would walk to the neighbors. They would still see their friends instead of just talking to them on the phone. And he said this was a very face-to-face, because the things that they were talking about oftentimes were very consequential. They were things of weight.
Well, think about that. Okay, so they're going next door, right? Talking about the newspaper, and then at that time there's probably two papers. I don't know if we used to have the Journal and Tribune here. So you're talking about Walter Cronkite or whoever's on the news at that time, and actually face-to-face conversations about pertinent issues. Now, text, Skype, it's so different. It's so different. I don't know what kind of generation, I always say that. Every generation is different, right? So I used to say that to my son, and I still do. It's like, okay, well, if we're doing this now, right, what's next for your kid? What's next? I mean, I don't know if it's so good. I mean, information is at the, at the touch of a fingertip, right? But as far as communication, those are the things you're saying. I see those things in my mind, and neighbors were there for trusting each other. It's so different now. I can remember where we lived on Eastern Avenue, and I can remember all the neighbors, and they all got together, and they visited, and
not just once in a while.
Trusted, and can we help? And God, it's so different now. Even in our neighborhood, it's just still so different. Everybody's kind of in their own little shell.
So the question is the pendulum going to swing the other way?
I don't know. I don't see it. I don't know. Because everyone, think about it, is even me sometimes with my phone. Sometimes, I'm in a communication with a lot of people, and I probably do. My wife's like, hey, look, you need to back off. She's not wrong, because I do sports stuff and I write sports stuff, and so I'm in communication with about, it seems like 10 people a day, besides the job. Besides
the job.
Right, and then I got to communicate, with 50 people a day there. So I think communication, just the way you mentioned it, is just, I see the image of neighbors, over the fence back in the day, and trust, neighbors really coming to neighborhood blocks parties, neighborhood watches, and they used to be so prevalent, even in the early 90s. Not so much anymore. I don't know.
When you think about this, the change that was happening is, people were moving out of the agrarian lifestyle into the suburbs. Think back about how the shift happened in terms of where the population went. This is when the suburbs just exploded. And so people weren't living tight like they used to, but they weren't living as far apart as they used to. So they had different experiences. This is a demographic that experienced things very differently than the generation before them. And in some ways than the generation after, because in the baby boomers, they just kind of had some stuff that had already kind of taken place. So some things were normal that were not normal for this generation, because this generation kind of cultivated it.
Right. Yes. That's a lot of different generations and a lot of, think about the history of this country. Sometimes we forget. And it's a fascinating one, and it's still being made every day. It's, it's a changing landscape every single day, politically, socially, economically, every single day. And I still think, it's we got our issues, no doubt, but as far, think about all the cultures we have here. It's a free-thinking society. That's why we're so divided, right? I mean, there's no people are always wondering what's going to take to unite. Well, everyone thinks different. You can't make anyone think this isn't a dictatorship or communism here.
And the neat thing is that it was the silent generation that sowed the seeds for the freedom, for the social acceptance. We've had the freedom. The freedom was granted to us. But having the social acceptability to disagree, the social acceptability to say, you know what, I was raised to believe this. But I've met this person, I've gotten to know this person, I want this person in my life, I want this person in my daily life, and so I'm not going to relegate them to the different side of town anymore.
Right, and it was done back then.
Exactly.
Yes.
So these people, you want to talk about courage, these people have incredible courage.
So the differences you're talking about could have been religion, they could have been social economic differences, racial differences, and back in the day, you're right, it was frowned upon and looked down on, and yes, that's what makes this country so great is the number of opinions and cultures that we have here, in my opinion. We have one more question for you, and what do we need to keep in mind when engaging with members of the silent generation? That's, I think, a great question, and our last one of the show. So, what do we have to keep in mind? I mean, I'll tell you one thing. I'll tell you when I communicate with the people that I do, there's a lot of things I got to keep in mind at Manzano Mesa, a whole bunch.
With so many generations,
oh
absolutely.
Man, and, you know what? And I've learned so much by.
I'll bet you have.
Oh man, and I really have, and even with my mother before my mother passed, I learned a lot about patience. My mother may have repeated herself 10 times. I just I acted like that's the first time I heard. That's my mom, man. I still miss her to this day. So what do we have to keep in mind when communicating with members? What should we keep in mind?
This is a group of people who you do not get in their face. Confrontation is not something that is really, really important to them as a whole, as a demographic. So when you're talking to these folks, you're being very respectful. Your communication is not quite as free or as casual as it used to be. When I'm training caregivers that work for us at home instead, one of the things I talk to them is that the generation that we live in, our communication is really about as casual as our dress. For this population, they still have a lot of respect for tradition, a lot of respect for yes ma'am, no sir. This is a population who still has very strong expectations for quality. So when you're working with these folks, you're not going to be able to do a halfway job and it be respected or be appreciated.
Interesting. Interesting. That reminds me so much of my dad. I'm sorry.
It's
My
true.
dad would say, look, if you're going to do a job, do it right or don't do it at all. And that still resonates in my mind. Keep going. I'm sorry.
But
it just
no.
always brings back memories.
But you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
And you have experienced this in your life as well, because it's our parents that are the silent generation. They're the ones that taught us that, if something goes wrong, you don't get in somebody's face, but you handle it very quietly, but very powerfully. And this is a quiet but powerful generation. Never underestimate these folks. And keep in mind, when you're working with this generation, if you deliver something that you did a halfway job, or that you didn't make good on your promises, they're going to call you on it every time. And it is amazing to me how I'm seeing that in our business and in working with this group of generation. They don't add, if you sell them this, we're going to do this, this, and this. If you don't do this, this, and this, they're not happy campers at all. They're not asking for extra. They're asking that you do what you said you did, the way you said you would do it.
So back in the day, my father would, handshake was, your word, man. Your word. I live by that. Somebody tells me if I promise something or if I tell you I'm going to be there, my word is something. It means something. And I don't know that this new generation gets it. And you know what? It's a new generation. We can't expect them to be just like that generation or that generation. But those things that you talk about, they're so important. Because when you're talking about that, I swear, I hear my mom and dad in my ear, and they always are. They're always there because they had such a powerful influence on my brother and my sister and I, and even on my son. Because and my wife's parents, same thing. They grew up the same way. So man, that is a powerful, powerful, silent but not silent.
I had a very young caregiver who works for us. She's very young, and she was talking to me about the fact that she felt like that sometimes our clients didn't give her as much of a chance as she would like to have. And she said, they don't understand that I'm different, but I'm not always wrong. And I think that is where, as the generations are different and dramatically different, because the younger generations are dramatically different than the generations before them. We have to remember it's different. It is not different is not necessarily wrong.
All right. Right. I think, with young people, the older people are going to look at them like you're young, you're wet behind the ears, we got about a minute left, and God, we could probably go on another 2 hours.
Probably.
Wrap it up for us, Silent Generations. It's been a great talk, by the way. Brought back a lot of memories. It really did.
I'm glad.
Yeah, so wrap it up for us.
So in general, when you're working with this generation, remember, you can't overlook them. These are people who are very quietly powerful, and these are people who expect that you do what you say, and they demand quality.
You know what? We need more of that. We do. I mean, this is what built a lot of this country.
That's right.
It was that. Gosh, I hope, in a way, hopefully you talked about pendulums. pendulum. Hopefully that can swing back there.
But isn't it going to be interesting to see what happens? And I think we live in a time where, because we have such access to media and information,
every day, every second.
I think we're going to get to see how society unfolds much more easily than folks who didn't have the internet and social media.
Yeah, no question. Cindy Brown, social worker, Home Instead Senior Care, the silent generation. Thanks so much for being our guest.
It is always my pleasure.
You bet. For the Department of Senior Affairs, I'm Ed Nunez.